It rarely begins with something painful. It usually begins with a compliment. They're so thoughtful. They're always willing to help. They're such a nice person. Those words feel warm. They feel like proof that kindness matters. And in many ways, they do. The world has always needed people who are patient, people who listen, people who quietly carry burdens that aren't theirs, simply because someone had to. Kindness has always been one of the quiet forces holding human relationships together. But every strength casts a shadow, and sometimes, the very thing that makes a person deeply loved slowly asks them to disappear. It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody decides to lose themselves. It happens quietly. One favor becomes two become 10, until saying yes no longer feels like a decision. It simply feels like who they are. And without anyone intending it, a quiet expectation begins to grow. The dependable person will handle it. They'll understand. They'll make the sacrifice. After all, they always do. At first, people notice. They say thank you. They appreciate the effort. But the human mind adapts remarkably quickly. What once felt extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. Not because people are always selfish, but because familiarity quietly changes perception. A kindness repeated often enough can stop feeling like a gift. It starts feeling expected. And that's when everything begins to change. The kindness hasn't changed. Only the way it's seen. Perhaps that's the most confusing part. The person who keeps giving rarely notices the shift. They still believe every yes is a choice. They don't realize that, for someone else, it has already become part of their identity. Not simply a kind person, but the person who will always say yes. And the moment kindness becomes an expectation, it quietly stops feeling like a choice. There is something almost invisible that many kind people carry with them. They never chose it. They never spoke the words aloud. In fact, they may not even realize it's there. But somewhere, deep inside, an unwritten agreement begins to take shape. If I am good to people, they will be good to me. If I make life easier for everyone else, someone will notice. Someone will remember. Someone will be there when I need them. It feels fair. It feels human. Because relationships are meant to be built on care that flows both ways. But life rarely keeps score the way people hope it will. Kindness is not a receipt. It doesn't guarantee loyalty. It doesn't guarantee gratitude. And it doesn't guarantee that someone will carry you simply because you carried them. Sometimes, the kindest person in the room is also the loneliest. Not because nobody loves them, but because everyone has quietly become used to leaning on them. That is the strange thing about constant generosity. The more dependable it becomes, the less visible it often feels. Think about sunlight. Almost nobody stops each morning to thank it for rising. Not because it isn't extraordinary, but because it has become expected. Human beings adapt remarkably quickly. What is always there slowly fades into the background. The same thing can happen in relationships. The friend who always answers the phone. The colleague who always stays behind. The sibling who always understands. The partner who always gives in. Little by little, they stop feeling like people making a choice. They begin feeling like people who will always be there. And that's when something quietly changes. People stop asking, "Can you?" They begin assuming, "You will." It isn't always selfishness. It isn't always cruelty. Sometimes, it's simply how the human mind responds to consistency. But understanding why it happens doesn't make carrying it any lighter. Because beneath every quiet yes, there is often another hope that never finds its voice. The hope that one day, when they are the one who needs someone, someone will already be there. There is a question that rarely gets asked. Not, why are some people so kind, but what happens when kindness no longer feels like a choice? Because there is a quiet difference between giving and feeling unable to refuse. From the outside, those two people look exactly the same. They both smile, they both help, they both say yes. But inside, they are living completely different stories. One offers kindness freely, the other quietly fears the cost of saying no. They imagine the awkward silence, the disappointed expression, the change in someone's voice, the possibility of being seen as selfish, difficult, or unkind. So they say yes, not because they have the time, not because they have the energy, but because saying no feels heavier than carrying one more burden. And after enough repetitions, the mind quietly begins to mistake peace for the absence of conflict. It whispers, if everyone around me is happy, then everything must be okay. But there is another kind of conflict, the one no one else can see, the promise to rest, that is broken again. The meal that grows cold because someone else's emergency came first. The message that says, of course I'll do it, sent by hands that are already exhausted. Little by little, kindness begins to cost more than it restores, and almost nobody notices. Not friends, not family, sometimes, not even the person living it. Because exhaustion doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, hidden behind another smile, hidden behind another polite, it's okay. But perhaps it was never okay. Perhaps they had simply become so used to putting themselves last that it no longer felt unusual. It simply felt normal. And when self-sacrifice starts to feel normal, kindness is no longer being given. It's quietly being surrendered. There is a moment that almost never announces itself. No conversation, no argument, no dramatic betrayal. Just a quiet shift. So quiet that both people often miss it. The kind person slowly stops being seen as a person and starts being seen as a role. The reliable one, the understanding one, the one who stays late, the one who never complains, the one who always finds a way. Roles are strange things. The longer someone lives inside them, the more permanent they begin to feel. Eventually, people stop wondering how that person is doing. They only wonder whether they can help again. Not because they stopped caring, but because the role has become louder than the person inside it. Imagine seeing someone every day carrying a heavy backpack. On the first day, you notice the weight. On the 10th, you admire their strength. By the 100th, you barely notice the backpack at all. It has quietly become part of who you think they are. Emotional burdens disappear in much the same way. The person who is always available eventually becomes the person everyone expects to be available. Their kindness becomes invisible, not because it became smaller, but because it became expected. Perhaps that is the saddest part. The more dependable they become, the harder it becomes to imagine them needing help. After all, they're always the strong one. They're always smiling. So when they finally grow tired, the world is surprised. Not because the exhaustion is new, but because nobody realized it had been growing quietly all along. Sometimes. Not even the person carrying it. Somewhere between being appreciated and being expected, they disappeared, behind the role they had spent years performing. Perhaps that's the quiet tragedy. The world didn't stop seeing them overnight. It simply became easier to see the role than the person. Eventually, something changes. Not in everyone else. In the person who has spent years saying yes. They become tired, not of helping, but of disappearing. They begin to notice the promises they made to themselves, and how often those promises came last. They notice how easily they remember everyone else's needs, and how difficult it has become to recognize their own. So one day, they do something that feels incredibly small. They say, "I can't." Two simple words. Words that most people say without thinking. Yet for someone who has spent years carrying everyone else, they can feel almost impossible. And something unexpected happens. Some people understand. Others seem confused. A few become disappointed. Not because the boundary was cruel, but because it interrupted a pattern they had quietly come to depend on. Think of a bridge people cross every single day. Nobody stops to admire it. They simply expect it to be there. Until one morning, the bridge is closed. Suddenly, everyone notices what they had stopped seeing. Expectations work in much the same way. The first no doesn't just refuse a request. It interrupts a story. A story that quietly says, they'll always help. They'll always understand. They'll always make room. But no human being was ever meant to carry a role forever. Because roles don't become exhausted. People do. Perhaps that is the hardest truth of all. Some relationships were built around unlimited access rather than genuine understanding. So when access changes, the relationship feels different. Not because kindness disappeared, but because the expectation did. Healthy relationships make room for boundaries. Expectations built on endless access often struggle to recognize them. There is an important difference. One asks, "Are you okay?" The other asks, "Why aren't you doing what you always do?" Those questions sound almost the same, but they come from completely different places. Sometimes, the first boundary doesn't reveal who changed. It reveals what the relationship had quietly become. Perhaps kindness was never the problem. The world has always needed kind people. People who listen. People who forgive. People who make life a little lighter for everyone around them. The problem begins when kindness quietly becomes the price of being accepted. When saying yes feels safer than being misunderstood. When carrying everyone else becomes easier than admitting you are tired. Somewhere along the way, many people learned how to protect everyone else's feelings, but never learned how to protect their own. So they kept giving, not because they had endless strength, but because they had forgotten that they were allowed to have limits. Perhaps that's what makes this story so human. Nobody wakes up hoping to lose themselves. They disappear in small, ordinary moments. One promise, one favor. One apology they never owed. One more yes. Until one day, they can no longer remember the last time they asked themselves a simple question. What do I need? Not, what does everyone else need? Just, what do I need? Maybe the strongest people aren't the ones who carry everything. Maybe they're the ones who know what was never theirs to carry. Because kindness doesn't become more beautiful when it destroys the person offering it. It simply becomes invisible. Real kindness doesn't ask someone to disappear. It leaves room for two people, the one who receives and the one who gives. Perhaps that's what boundaries really are. Not walls, not rejection, just quiet reminders that every human heart deserves the same care it so willingly offers everyone else. Somewhere, someone is answering one more message, agreeing to one more favor, apologizing one more time, while quietly hoping someone notices how exhausted they have become. Maybe this video isn't about them. Maybe it's about someone you know. Or maybe, without even realizing it, it has been about you all along. Project Human. Understanding ourselves, one story at a time.